Next question, are Clif Bars a good intra-ruck fuel source? Why or why not? No, they would not be the best. Clif Bars have anywhere from like 4 to 7 grams of fiber in them and probably around the same amount of fat, which is not a ton. And that's not a bad thing in general. But when you are actually performing, when you're out there doing a ruck, this is assuming that you're trying to ruck fast, not necessarily, if you're doing a super long ass hike and it's hours and hours and hours and hours on end, then Clif Bars are totally fine because you're not in that super high stressed out scenario where it's very difficult for your body to digest things and actually put the food you're eating into your bloodstream so it can actually perform its duties. But if you are doing something like a 12-mile ruck time trial, 8-mile ruck time trial, something along those lines, or if you're just doing some sort of training session that involves ruck running, you're going to be in zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, etc. And you're doing it for less than, I would say, 3.5 hours, then you're just going to want to stick to very, very quick, fast digesting carbohydrates because the fiber and the fat in Clif Bars or anything else that has fiber and fat will slow digestion down and most likely become a GI nightmare. You might feel a lot of nausea. You might feel bloat. You might burp a lot. It might just sit in your stomach, cause cramps, side stitches, etc. You want very fast digesting types of carbohydrates when you are doing any sort of hard ruck or run. So Clif Bars would not be a great option for that. And while we're on this question, there are a couple other questions that I got about how to fuel rucks. So I'm going to tie those into this question. So like I said, fast digesting carbohydrates, basically no other macros in them. And this is, of course, again, if you're going slower, not super duper long hours and hours. So you want usually a combination between liquid and solid or goos or gels or something along those lines. For most people, you want to probably start out around 50 grams of carbs per hour, maybe 60, depending on your size. You want to kind of start low because even though you could, and you hopefully will eventually be able to consume more carbs per hour, you want to start low so you can slowly titrate that dose up. What you don't want is to start too high with 80, 90, 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour if you're not used to it and then run into GI issues or digestive issues. The goal should be to get as many grams of carbs per hour as possible without any sort of GI issues. And this just takes practice. It takes, like anything, your body adapts to it over time. There are Tour de France cyclists that can take in 130, 140 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but they didn't start there. They probably started at 40, 50, 60, and then worked their way up to find a good solid spot where they can take in as many grams as they can without having to run to the bathroom or puke or just be bloated and gassy. So it's a little bit of trial and error, and the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. But I would start with something like maybe 20 to 30 grams of carbs from a liquid source, whether that's Tailwind or Gatorade, a little bit of watered down Gatorade. You can also, the good thing about Tailwind and Gatorade, they have electrolytes as well. Usually I would recommend adding a little bit more salt to the Gatorade just because the sodium content is a little bit low, especially if it's warmer out or if you sweat a lot or if you know you're a salty sweater. Generally speaking, I would add 300 to 400, maybe 500 milligrams of sodium to it in any sort of salt form just to get that sodium up. Tailwind's pretty good with electrolytes, maybe a little bit of salt, but it really just depends on the person. But the problem with only relying on the liquid carbs is to get enough carbs per hour, you're also going to have to drink a ton of that actual fluid. And drinking too much fluid on a ruck or on a run is also not a good thing. It's going to, A, probably cause some GI issues, but B, it's going to overhydrate you. Your body can only take in so much water and fluid per hour when you're training. And a lot of people will think better take in more water because hydration. And when you do that and you go way overboard, if you're taking in 30, 32 plus ounces of water per hour, you think you're doing something good. But in reality, what you're doing is just making it so a lot of the symptoms of overhydration and the results of it, like the performance results of it, are similar to the performance results and the symptoms of dehydration. So you don't want to be too hydrated. So you probably should go back and forth between liquid and solid. So you can get another 30-ish grams of carbs per hour from a goo packet. Usually those are 25 to 30 grams of carbs. Or you could use the little gels, the gummies. Clif blocks are great, things along those lines. Or if you want to go the cheap route, you can go buy some Sour Patch or some Sour Skittles, whatever your gas station candy of choice is, and use that. Of course, you want to keep it just candy. So, chocolate bars and things like that, probably fine, especially if you're going longer, like the Clif Bar example. But if you're eating a Snickers every 30 minutes, there's enough fat in there that it's going to slow digestion down. And that's not necessarily what you want, especially if you're going hard. So you want to keep it to like things like I just mentioned, the Sour Patch, the Swedish Fish, etc. Pure sugar, basically. So back and forth between those two, experiment with different things that you enjoy, that make you feel good, that you can afford. Some of the goos and gels are super expensive and you don't need to buy like these super highly formulated things. Like I said, you could literally just use gas station candy. And unless you're an elite athlete or something along those lines, it's not going to make a difference. So that would be how I prepare it. Just to reiterate the numbers. Make sure it's low fat, low fiber, no fat, no fiber. 16-ish to 24-ish ounces of water, maybe a little bit more if you're a massive individual and you're rucking and it's hot out and you know you can handle that much water. You've kind of worked your way up to it. But 16 to 24 is usually a good spot. Regardless of the weather, regardless of the humidity, you're going to be totally fine in there. A lot of people think if it's hotter and more humid, they need to go way, way more on the water. It's really not that much. It's maybe a few ounces per hour, so long as you're hydrated going into these things and well fed. So let's start that again. Low fat, low fiber, very fast digesting sugar, 50 to 60, work your way up grams of carbs per hour, 16 to 24 ounces of fluid, anywhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour. You can absolutely use just regular salt if you want. You can use some sort of pre-formulated electrolyte beverage. You can titrate the sodium dose based on what you're drinking as far as electrolytes are concerned, based on your sweat rate, based on your sweat saltiness. You can actually buy for pretty cheap sweat testers that actually test how salty your sweat is. But a good rudimentary way to determine that is just to kind of look at your hat or your shirt or whatever, if it's really salty, or, you know, if your eyes sting when you sweat. Mine sting like crazy. So I'm like a very, very salty sweater, but I've also done sweat tests as well. It's this little patch you put on your skin. It'll tell you approximately how much sodium per hour. And I believe they tell you the full hydration formulation for sodium plus water plus other electrolytes per hour. And that's what you really want to focus on. A lot of people make the mistake of going for like Body Armor or coconut water or something along those lines. Those are totally fine to drink when you're not training, but they're very high in potassium and low in sodium. And you lose a lot more sodium in your sweat than potassium. So you want a high sodium drink. Even only sodium would be totally fine during your training. And then potassium you can get from food elsewhere, because it's still very important. You just don't lose as much of it in sweat. So you can get that potassium elsewhere from other beverages and other foods throughout the rest of the day. And then also you could consider some salt tabs if, you know, you need more salt and say you're drinking an electrolyte drink and it's not high enough in sodium, but you don't add sodium to it. You can also do salt tabs every so often, and that will help as well, especially if it's really, really hot out. So hopefully that gives you a good idea as to why Clif Bars are not great and what to do instead.